that its main function, as I learned at that time in Laos and the Philippines, is intervening covertly in the affairs of other countries. And in fact, covert action, by the CIA's own definition, is activity, secret activity, which can be carried out without the knowledge of the targets of that activity being able to learn that it was carried out by the CIA, or in fact by the U.S. government.
And what led you and your colleagues to found the Covert Action Information Bulletin? When did you begin to do this?
Well, it was after a long succession of efforts, largely growing out of the Watergate revelations, of the Church Committee and Pike Committee reports, even the Rockefeller Commission reports, which documented gross and ongoing and very large-scale CIA covert activities that had been carried out. Up till that time, the American people didn't know very much about this. And that was really what the CIA is about, is keeping it secret from the American people. In sum, the CIA's activities, of course, are known to the people against whom they're carried out, but it's the American people who are the last to know about it. And we, as a result of a lot of those revelations and a lot of other people who were concerned about it, decided to try and put together a journalistic effort to look into these areas. There was another magazine, Counterspy, which started earlier, and after several years it bit the dust, and we decided after 2 years in 1978 to start Covert Action Information Bulletin.
Well, it looks like there's going to be some real problems coming up, not only just for you and Covert Action Information Bulletin, but also for civil liberties in general in the United States and finding out what's happening, what our government is doing in our name covertly around the world. With the Intelligence Identities Protection Act just about to be passed in Congress, and with Reagan's Executive Order 12333, things are going to be quite different shortly, aren't they?
There is clearly a very marked escalation towards secrecy in this government. These two pieces of one legislation and one executive order. The executive order does not have to be propounded by Congress. Congress doesn't have a single word to say about it. Basically, these two working in tandem with each other, along with other efforts by this administration to embed the CIA and the other intelligence agencies, of which there are some 18 federal agencies, in secrecy.
This bill is the CIA's greatest operation without any qualifications. It's better than, in terms of their interest, than when they installed the Shah in power. It's better than the coup in Guatemala. And of course there are many failures from their own point of view. Better than putting Pinochet in power in terms of CIA values. What it is nothing less than an Official Secrets Act. This is the legislation that the CIA has been trying for 30 years to get, to give it legal protection and legal exemption from freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Now, what makes it such a beautiful operation is that it is in the process of being passed. It's going through the Congress more or less like a dose of the salts. With the Senate voted on it a couple of months ago, the vote was something like 90-2, and the House it's expected to pass by a similar majority, and yet the American people by and large, including media people, including television interviewers across the nation and journalists, are oblivious that it's even passing, much less what it really means. Now, what it really means, see, it's couched, and what makes it such a typical and beautiful CIA operation is that it's couched in the terms of protecting our agents who are out in the cold, risking their lives to defend the country. This is Senator Benson was the original sponsor of this bill, by the way. And this was what he said about it in many speeches here in Texas. Now it's passed to Senator John Chafee and Jake Garnes sponsoring the bill in Washington. Now, who can argue with that? Legal protection from our agents whose names are being exposed by irresponsible people who don't agree with the government's policies. Now, if the facts were that simple, if those were the true facts, who could argue with it? But the truth is that these agents' lives are not in danger because of their names being exposed. The truth is that these agents are functioning from embassies with diplomatic passports under circumstances in which if the worst possibly happens and they're absolutely caught buying secrets from some local spy agent, a minister in the government or whatnot, the worst that will happen to them, even in the Soviet Union, is that they will be asked to leave the country. Under no circumstances will they ever be attacked or jailed or executed or whatnot.
By a government, another government.
By the host government,
Right.
where they're living and breaking all the local laws by being a secret agent and recruiting spies and inducing people to commit treason. Now, in the 4 or 5 posts that I served in overseas full-time, we had full liaison with the president of the country, the chief of the police, and all the police officers and all the military officers. This means that we met with them weekly in the name of the CIA, no secrets, to have lunch or dinner and exchange information and do favors for each other. If there were ever a terrorist attack or threat against one of us, the first thing we would do would be to pick up the telephone and call the local police chief and say, hey, there's a threat against us. And I might note that this would also apply in the Soviet Union. If there were a terrorist threat in Moscow against the U.S. Embassy or a U.S. case officer or a CIA man, they would call the local police and say, you know, somebody's about to blow us up. There is a brotherhood of secret, quote, secret police agents that functions like a brotherhood even when they're supposedly on the other side. They're competing, but it's sort of like professional football players. They're on different teams, but they're still professional football players.
Well, you had buddies who were KGB agents.
Oh, indeed. Played tennis with them, played chess with them, socialized with them, went drinking with them, and that was the SOP for all case officers everywhere. 2,000 plus, well over 2,000 names have been revealed, printed, published in the last few years, and not one agent has been killed because of his name being revealed.
Now, there were 2 cases where it looked like they were put-up jobs, right? Which the congressman and the CIA always mention as the reason
which
we
they
had to have
jumped
this.
on.
Yeah.
Richard Welch in Athens, the 18th of December in 1975, was killed. He was shot up by terrorists in front of his home. And at that moment, the church committee, which was in full session, was out of business. Washington, every door in Washington closed on the church committee because as though the church investigation had anything whatsoever to do with it. They flew him back and gave him a full state ceremony, which of course was admission that he was CIA to the world. I mean, the headlines were CIA chief killed. They didn't say the third secretary of embassy killed. The United States government made as much politics as they could out of the fact that this man was a career diplomat agent. Now, the fact was, they caught the terrorist that killed him, and they ascertained, they verified that those were the individuals who had published his name in an Athens newspaper 3 days before they killed him because they wanted world attention to what they were doing. And it had nothing to do with the investigations or publications in Washington, and they already planned to kill him. Now, this man had been ordered by CIA security to change houses because he was living in the same house that 8 other CIA station chiefs had lived in before him. Generation after generation after generation after generation of CIA station chiefs had lived in that same mansion. It was a big villa in a very posh part of Athens. As governments had changed, coups, the colonels' coups, the monarchy in and out of power much earlier, and dealing with all of the terrorist activities and anti-terrorist activities and coups in the Middle East from Athens, with the CIA heavily involved with each government and change of government and the ins and outs in these governments, and yet the CIA station chief was living in the same house throughout. Eventually he was killed. He refused to move because he said it was a good house. Now, there is no way that that can be blamed on U.S. journalists publishing names in Washington. Moreover, as I pointed out, the CIA director, Bill Colby, exploited that man's death to make a big issue and to effectively close down the church committee.
Which was investigating the CIA
which was investigating
malpractices.
The CIA's extensive malpractices. They put the church committee on the defensive and out of business. Now, there was one other incident in El Salvador where 2 agents who were under a labor cover were killed by by the government police, the secret police. They're treasury agents, is it, in El Salvador that do the killing down there. Now, these 2 guys were in contact with the government. They were killed by government agents, set up in a hotel and shot. And the United States announced to the world that they were secret agents. Their names had been published much previously, but the United States identified them, thereby admitting they were agents and admitting that they were using this labor organization as cover. Where did they make this announcement? They did it, the prosecuting attorney, the State Department's representative in the passport case in which they took Phil Agee's passport away from him, revealed the identities of these agents and claimed that that proved that people publishing their names led to their deaths. They were already dead when the government chose to use a totally fictitious, a totally false ploy to discredit Phil Agee. He had not revealed their names. And so it's now in the Supreme Court records. It's cited by the Supreme Court justices in their decision against Phil Agee and his passport, him keeping his passport, these agents being killed, i.e. the Supreme Court and the State Department revealed their identities to accomplish their objective against Phil Agee.
There was another situation in Jamaica where it looked like it was a plan put up job that failed.
In that case, indeed, the chief of station's house was shot up with machine gun bullets, and so they made considerable propaganda publicity out of that with photographs of the bullets. But it's true his name had been published, but what happened is the back wall of his garage, well away from the house, received 5 machine gun bullets at a time when his family was out of the country and he was not in the house. And yet they tried to use that to make publicity to show that it made it dangerous to have the names revealed.
It was also during an election where the opposition to the social democratic government wanted to make it appear that terrorism was rampant in Jamaica. And so wasn't there some political exploitation?
Oh, indeed. There was considerable political exploitation of it, and all evidence points that it was the government secret police that fired the bullets.
Right.
But again, the press in Washington cooperated with the CIA to give publicity for the bill against the exposing of names.
So there's no real need for the bill. It's not protecting in any way our national security. It's not required by the history of the CIA.
Precisely. On the one hand, that's the problem, and I go a bit further to point out that these agents, 80% of them were identified from overt information in the Library of Congress. The people publishing the Covert Action Information Bulletin go to the Library of Congress and go through the State Department's overt records of its personnel and come up with the CIA officers' names infallibly, because there are little indicators in there which anyone can go in and read through and say that's CIA and that's CIA and that's CIA.
Plus, isn't it just generally known in most CIA stations who is CIA?
It's
Don't they want
universally
themselves to be known?
We used to call
it contacts and information.
We used to call it wearing an invisible badge. You acted as though you had a badge, CIA up here. You drew people to you. I'm CIA, talk to me. You were taught to do this. Alan Dulles, and the original CIA great, in his book, The Craft of Intelligence, makes this point that you have to be known to be an effective intelligence officer. But see, that's on the one hand. The bill is not necessary, and it's dishonest in that sense. It's based on false premises. On the other hand, the bill is so written that it goes far beyond the protection of agents' names. For example, the bill is so written that it will be a felony for agents' names to be published even if they're already, to republish the names, even if they've already been published, as in the Library of Congress or anywhere else. It also includes activities of agents, so that you can, if an agent kicks in the door of your house and rapes your wife or whatever, and you publish a story about it without citing the name, it would still be a felony.
Under the executive order, so we have to see both the executive order and the Intelligence Identities Bill as almost part of a package. Under the executive order, the CIA now will be allowed, and is allowed since it was signed in December by the President, it is now law, the CIA will be allowed to carry out covert activities in the United States, as well as all the other agencies too. So that if you were to discover, for example, that a member of an intelligence agency had infiltrated, say, your church organization, your student organization, a trade union, or whatever organization, or any group of more than 2 people, was infiltrated, and you discovered this, and you so much as mentioned it to a friend without even writing a news article or without even talking about it on the media, on television, for example, you could be held criminally liable under this bill. And we're talking about a bill which authorizes or which penalizes persons for 15 years in prison, 5 years in prison, $15,000 fine, or both, for persons who've never worked in the government. And that's a pretty heavy price to have to pay to try and hold up your rights, to stand up for your rights against the onslaught of the intelligence agencies.
Now, the New York Times, to give you the proof of the argument that this is an official secrets act, the New York Times, in questioning the sponsors of the bill on the floor of the Senate, pointed out that as it was written, if the London Times published a story about CIA activities and the station chief, some scandal of some kind, the New York Times couldn't republish the London Times story without committing a felony. And the sponsor of the bill slapped his hand on the table and said, "That's right. We want to knock off all this criticism of the CIA."
Well, the situation that's already come up with the revelation of CIA activity in Iran recently, which was not published in the United States for very long, but eventually it got either the Washington Post or the New York Times did it, and there was a big uproar because they were publishing it.
And in the last hearings, the New York Times, questioning again Senator Chafee about this bill, said that as they read it, they would not be able to publish their very legitimate and valuable stories about the activities of CIA agents Ed Wilson and Frank Turple, who were selling terrorist technology to Libya after they left the CIA, without committing a felony. And Senator Chafee said, yes, in the future the Washington Post and the New York Times will have to be careful what they publish about the CIA.
I should say, if this bill had been law then, we would have never known about Watergate.
It would have been illegal to expose it.
Absolutely. But now it will be clear to many more Americans that there is a sort of a split-level foreign policy, as there is a split-level policy at home. There is the rhetoric, and then there is the reality. And with secrecy in their vest pocket, they can now carry out a lot of these activities and do it, as they say, legally. And once more, we're going back to the age of almost the cowboy politics that the CIA carried out in the 50s and 60s. They claim, as a result of the Church Committee and other revelations, that they don't do that anymore. Well, this administration is not only not saying that, but they're saying that it's now legal, and now they're being very upfront about covert activity. In many cases, the covert activities are now being overt activities.
It's been talking about the CIA being the main focus of this bill, but it isn't just the CIA, it's the FBI, where they're involved in, quote, anti-terrorist activities, and of course Reagan has said anybody who dissents is a terrorist and involved in disinformation. That's no exaggeration.
That's great.
And also any of the other government or military intelligence organizations.
I think many Americans, as a result of these two matters and others also, will begin to learn what it's like to live in a third world country which is being targeted by the CIA. Many Americans have lost sight of the fact that many citizens of other countries, particularly in the third world, have been the victims of massive CIA operations, covert operations. Everything from recruitment to bribery to buying of an election, on up the line to paramilitary activities and terrorism, training and torture, and even assassination and overthrowing of governments. And I think that Americans fail to realize this until it starts sometimes to hit them at home. And that's apparently what's going to be happening now, and legally. This administration makes no bones that it wishes to, that it sees its own people, many of us, as the enemy. And in fact, there are many people, I think, in the country who consider themselves very middle of the road, who would be opposed to this.
It is absolutely incompatible with our system of government as we have known it in the past. Moreover, it's written to include, obviously, more than the CIA.
That was
all government agencies that have a right to secrecy will be included in this thing.
John, this is literally unconstitutional, though.
This is absolutely unconstitutional.
Freedom of speech.
It seems to us that there are people in Congress who are prepared to relegate the First Amendment to a lower priority, and they are more interested in what they call national security. One member of Congress, as well as one deputy director of the CIA, once stated that the First Amendment, that's only an amendment. It seems to me that's a rather shocking description of one of the hallmarks of our Constitution.
This is why I call it their greatest operation, is they're doing it without a constitutional amendment, which is beautiful in itself. If they propose to have all the states ratify a bill saying throw out freedom of speech and freedom of the press and give the CIA a law, it would never pass. But on the one hand, they're doing it without constitutional amendments, and two, they're doing it without the nation even being aware of it, which says something about the vigilance of Americans and their own feelings about their freedom of speech and press. They could care less. They would rather watch a football game.
Why is this the case, or why have they gotten so far with it without media scrutiny, without public uproar, etc.? It's not just the apathy of the people. Isn't it also that the media just hasn't reported on what's involved in this?
Well, the media in this country is the most apathetic that I've ever seen in the world in terms of playing ball with the administration. 80% of our news is reporting quotations of political leaders. President Reagan giving a speech in which everything he says is either distortions of historical fact or propaganda statements, in effect,
or bald-faced lies,
or bald-faced lies, all mixed together, and yet the press will report his speech as a fact. It is a fact. He made a speech. He said those words, but they don't say at the end, and everybody in the room, that it was all balderdash. Now, there's a little bit more of that with Reagan than there was with other presidents, because he makes these misstatements so constantly. He gets the facts screwed up so much. But the press doesn't have any sense of defending its own rights. We have had an occasional editorial, including in the Austin American-Statesman, saying that the Names of Agents bill is unfortunate. And that's about the size. The New York Times ran an editorial saying this is unfortunate. They said it was kind of wistful. I read it when I was on my way to lecture at Yale and Wesleyan a couple of months ago, and I read it in the New York Times. They were saying, golly gee whiz, they mean this thing to apply to us too.
Yeah, there was another one which they mentioned Lewis Wolf, and they said, well, it's a bad bill, but on the other hand, we've got to take care of people like Lewis Wolf and maybe John Stockwell.
They cannot believe that that such a thing will actually apply to them.
But unfortunately, the CIA has many allies in Congress, and some even in the media. And so sometimes you can pick up a newspaper and read some of the CIA's own propaganda coming from some of those people.
What is the source of the CIA's power in Washington?
Well, I think it's the whole idea that the CIA has built up, even in the halls of Congress, that it is somehow a sacred entity, and that while there was a lot of criticism of J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI, not a whole lot of it while he was alive, it's all happened since he died. It's interesting because it is known, for example, that Hoover had a lot of information and a lot of very damaging information against members of Congress. It is also clear that the CIA maintains relations with a number of Congress people, some of whom have said so on the floor of Congress, that they are in close contact with the CIA. And this bill, for example, which was written by the CIA, and they said so. Deputy Director Frank Carlucci said it on national television back in 1978, and said we are now about to deliver this bill up to Congress. That's a little bit of a strange way for laws to be written if they're going to be written by the CIA.
Now, what this bill is, it's part of a number of bills and legal precedents that the government is obtaining to keep. Now, they're not going to go out and arrest the editor of the New York Times and put him in jail for 10 years the week after this bill is passed. They're not that stupid. But they're they may arrest Lew Wolf if he violates it. I think they probably would, because they could make propaganda out of such an arrest. But what they're doing is they're getting that bill, they're getting the passport ruling, for example, they're getting the other legal precedents, such as the lawsuit against Frank Snepp, Marchetti, and myself, and travel restrictions. They're getting authority for the Secretary of State to throw people out of the country who should have political exile here, such as the El Salvadorian refugees. And they're getting these things ready so that the next war that they get us into, as in Vietnam, they will have the legal power, muscle, to handle it differently than they did during the Vietnam War.
To handle dissent at home, to make it impossible to speak out.
The dissent that choked off Kissinger's and Nixon's, and before that Rusk's, efforts in Vietnam, the popular uprising at home that forced the United States government to abandon its policies and plans in Vietnam, will not be the government will have weapons to crush such a thing in the future. It'll have an Official Secrets Act to make it illegal to publish stories like My Lai and whatnot, because there were obviously secret agents involved. So the publication of the My Lai stories would be a felony. Jane Fonda and Cora Weiss's travels to try to make communication and establish some basis for working out a peaceful solution to the thing, they would snap their passports up in the future. And then the other restrictions on travel, the other restrictions on government agents, so that an officer who's been in the service can't stop and say, we were bombing villages and bombing churches and schools. That would be a felony. He would go to jail. It's a British Official Secrets Act with a different name.
You know, you were mentioning a while ago, it's not only just the CIA, but it's others too. We had a program recently, which you may remember, about the Greensboro massacres, in which the Klan and the Nazis, in broad daylight and in front of TV cameras, shot down 5 labor organizers and killed them in Greensboro, North Carolina. It came out by the investigations that Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms agents was working with the Nazis. Indeed, he was the one who gave them the names of the people to be shot. Also, there was FBI and local police complicity with the Klan members. As a matter of fact, it's come out that the FBI itself established over 40 chapters of the Klan over the years in North Carolina alone. These revelations would be a felony now.
Yeah. It would, exactly.
If this passes.
It would be a felony to reveal such information to the American public. Or government of, by, and for the people is soon to be a thing of the past in the United States.
What this will do is to put the CIA, the FBI, and these other government agencies outside of the realm of public criticism and even discussion.
Or law.
Yeah,
outside of the law. Right. Because they've broken every law of man and God in the activities they have conducted, the experimentation on American citizens, for example, with chemicals and disease, the propaganda of the United States, breaking and entering, Colonel White's famous words about where else can a red-blooded boy lie, kill, cheat, steal, rape, and pillage in the name of the All-Highest. Now they will be able to...
Who was this?
This was Colonel George M. White, one of the founders of the CIA, who eventually directed the MK Ultra program. Oh. And he was retiring. He and I overlapped by about 4 years. He came out of retirement to address my mid-career seminar, and telling about how we put the CIA together and we did this, that, and the other. In his letters, memoirs, he wrote and then allowed it to be published, that statement. Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill, cheat, steal, rape, and pillage with the blessings of the All-Highest? And that was before they had an Official Secrets Act to protect their activity.
John, there's been very few people in this country that have actually told us what the CIA has been up to and exposed some of their misdeeds, etc. You, of course, and a few other former agents have written some books and given lectures criticizing agents' activities. This would be impossible in the future, would it not be?
We will never know the truth and the details, the blood and gore, the extent of responsibility and culpability for the CIA's program in Nicaragua right now, unless someone like Reagan or in his a top official chooses to stand up and denounce what's happening, because top officials are exempt from these laws. But we will never know the truth about, for example, the Shah and the evacuation of Iran, and which was a debacle, I was told, by a friend of mine who was close to a third friend of mine who was part of the CIA security establishment in Iran, who said it was a debacle that far exceeded the evacuation of Vietnam, the evacuation of the United States from Iran. And this story will never come out. And the many other stories, the assassinations that probably are being planned today, such as the coup in Chile, or the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. These sort of things are going on, but the public won't know about them in the future.
Why has the government been so outraged by this publication and putting so much heat on them? I don't think there's any other publication in America that's had so much government pressure put on them than...
Well, you have two forces in the government functioning here. You have one is a defensive outrage against being attacked. Secret police organizations don't like to be exposed and attacked. That's the same anger that they focused at me. People who are performing activities that the full range of the society, the 90% of the society, would describe as depraved. People who are doing this while functioning under the cover of being legitimate State Department diplomats, prestigious cover positions, don't like to have their activities and names published for what they really are. This is traditional anywhere in the world. The goon squads in Chile don't like to be attacked, nor does the KGB in Russia to be attacked and exposed. But nowhere else in the world do they become as self-righteous and as vindictive as they do in Washington, where the United States ambivalence, the duplicity, the Jekyll and Hyde aspect of the United States character, where we profess such high ideals, and yet traditionally we have exploited, we have engaged in activities that included dropping atom bombs on women and children in Japan, eliminating large elements of the Indian population of this country, and in the past 30 years killing well over 800,000 people in the third world under circumstances that can only be called terrorism, but doing it pretending all the while to be idealistic, high-minded, human rights-oriented, freedom-loving people. Now, these values are brought together in the CIA, where people are diplomats by cover and CIA agents by trade. And when they have themselves exposed and have their children, their family, their friends find out that, hey, you weren't really a nice diplomat all these years, you were in fact running the Phoenix program in Vietnam that killed 40,000 people, including many innocent people. This isn't something that makes these people feel good, and they get very angry. Moreover, the nation in the mid-70s was clearly close to closing down the CIA, to rejecting this kind of activity. So they were fighting for their existence. And there you get into the other driving force of their reaction against Lew Wolf and Bill Schaap and myself and others, is just simply exploitation, working the thing against the people who... there is a theory, which is of course nonsense, that Phil Agee was sent by the CIA to reveal names to create an atmosphere which would lead eventually to an Official Secrets Act. Now that is certainly nonsense, and in the extent to which it discredits very honorable men, but the fact is that they are exploiting this revelation of names extensively to effect the passage of an Official Secrets Act. They've tried every other way over the past 30 years, every other way you could conceive of. They didn't succeed until modern times and the curious vacillation of the American public and Washington and the senators and congressmen in terms of just pure conservatism and callousness.
And I think that American people really have to understand that it is their rights which are being threatened here. Now, we are, among many people, ones who reject the idea that it's more important to protect our rights than people in other countries. Clearly, that is not the case. The minute we are involved in the torture or in the death of a single person in another country, our rights are being abridged and our tax money, to say the least, is being used
And
to
our
carry it out.
humanity is being violated because we're being asked to accept inhuman acts perpetuated in our name as Americans.
Plus the fact that it eventually will come home. If they use it successfully
Right.
overseas, they'll use it on the United States citizens as well.
One of the most interesting aspects of this bill and the current environment in Washington is to project what it does to the legal system of a free society like ours in terms of the individual when you begin to give a special police, a secret police, a legal priority, legal freedoms and rights over the citizens. We have some examples. We don't have to speculate. The bill isn't passed yet, and yet some of the things that have been happening in the last few years illustrate what we can look forward to. For example, one, to begin with a personal experience, I testified to the Senate a little over a year ago against this bill. I demanded the right to testify because they had ACLU testifying against it and journalists, but no one who had been inside, who knew about cover and could say, this is bullshit, I was there, we didn't do it that way. They acquiesced and let me testify. Now you have to write out a written statement before you testify and submit it, and then you verbally introduce yourself on the floor of the Senate, I am so-and-so, and then proceed to make a verbal statement which parallels the written statement. The Senate Intelligence Oversight Committee submitted my written statement to the CIA for censorship the day before my testimony. The CIA struck out two parts which were in the public record, published in my book and republished in many magazines. Overt information which both of you have read and many other people in this nation, 40,000 people or so that bought my book have read, which was not national security information, but there were two things that I cited that showed the CIA's disregard for agents' cover. It just illustrated the fact that that they weren't secret agents. The CIA struck them out and returned the report, deleting these points. Now, I was meeting with the representatives of the Senate committee just before I went on to testify, and the Senate legal counsel, the young attorney, threatened me right outside their office. I didn't have a badge to get inside their office. We were standing in a little foyer outside, and I mean, finger in the chest, thump, thump, you know. And I'm warning you, John Stockwell, do not use the floor of the Senate to challenge CIA review like this. And I'm backing up like that. Then we walk into the...
He didn't know you're an international karate champion.
And so then I went in to testify, and I began to introduce myself, and Jake Garnes from Utah, I was saying, you know, Stockwell, 19 years in the Marine Corps and Marine Corps Reserves, 13 years in the CIA, the wars and medals and whatnot, to establish the fact that I have certain credentials for having served my country. And he interrupted me to say, I know who you are, you're a traitor, and everything about you fills me with loathing and disgust. And I said, Senator, no one is going to say something like that to me anywhere. And he said, I just did, I have my freedom of speech too, and grinned at the cameras. And I said, yeah, but the difference is that I give you your freedom of speech, and you're trying to take mine away from me. Okay. In Frank Snep's case, where the government sued him to take a civil suit to take away the profits from his book, so-called. They took away all the gross proceeds, not just the profits. They took him into the fourth... Oh, yes, he couldn't deduct his typing costs or whatever. They took away the gross of everything the book had made. Now, in the first day of hearing in the 4th District Court under Judge Orrin Lewis, with all kinds of attorneys and journalists attending this thing, Orrin Lewis made statements which the Washington Post, 3 major newspapers in the nation, were virtually calling for his impeachment the next day for the bias of his statements. He said that it would not be necessary to have a jury, that he could handle it himself. He said that the facts in the case didn't interest him one damn bit. He said that it was his objective to take away from Mr. Snepp his, quote, ill-gotten gains.
That was before the trial even started.
This was the first day. This was in the first days of the thing.
Non-biased, open mind.
He did this in front of, like I say, 50 attorneys who were there because of the unconstitutional, the new law aspect of the case, and journalists, prominent journalists from all over the world. Now, that's horrifying, but what's much more horrifying is what follows. Frank Snepp and his attorney were relaxed after that, figuring that whatever happened, they had it won in the appeals because of his incredibly prejudiced statements then and throughout the case. He kept interrupting the state's counsel to disallow, to protest Snepp's positions and vice versa. I mean, he was conducting the hearings. Now, Snepp and Mark Lynch, the ACLU attorney working with him, felt that they had it absolutely won in the appeals. When they got the court record to go to the 4th District Appeals Court in Richmond, Virginia, those statements had been expunged from the record. And the appeals court refused to address itself to the fact that Orrin Lewis's prejudicial statements had been written out. The judge had gotten to the court recorder and told him to type the thing up without those statements in it.
Is that legal? What's the status of that?
That's a pure, raw felony. Orrin Lewis and the court recorder, or whoever did it, should get about 15 years for that. But the courts refused to consider the fact that the court record had been modified. There were 50 witnesses, 3 newspapers calling for the man's, virtually for the man's impeachment for his statements. And then when they get there, the court record, it doesn't say the same thing that all of these witnesses said it did afterwards. That's just one example.
This also shows very graphically how if you have these police agencies like the CIA or the FBI getting out of control, how they corrupt the entire legal system.
And then the case of Phil Agee that we mentioned previously in his passport hearing, where the state is revealing names, falsely claiming these men were killed in order to prove a point to get broader legislation for the CIA. And then just a little case that has no implications in terms of names of agents' bills or whatnot, freedom of speech, but it illustrates the point. Phil Litchke quit the CIA. He was writing a book about Koreagate, which I hope he gets published. It's truly a horrifying account of its own about the inside story of Korea. He submitted it for review, as the law requires him to do. They challenged it and deleted a lot of things. So then he would write footnotes saying, the information blanked out in the above paragraphs discusses a high-ranking CIA official who was taken out by Korean police and gotten drunk and coerced and blah, 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 but without, trying to come up with a footnote and then submit the footnotes for review. And he was truly a thorn in their side, and then they were having to address themselves to what of the footnotes could they, because, they eventually have to defend these things in court. But anyway, he was working on his book very seriously with them through the review process. His wife was unstable, treated for mental problems in psychiatric treatment. They were in the process of getting a divorce. The CIA had its counsels work with her and work with her counsels. Now, they claim this was necessary to prevent her or the divorce proceedings from revealing national security information, but she wasn't an employee of the CIA. They had prominent GS-17 CIA officers go to the divorce hearings and testify against Phil Litchke character assassination, saying things that his friends would absolutely deny in terms of his character and his stability. And when he and his attorney tried to cross-examine them, the court said no, because of national security. They couldn't be questioned on the statements they had made about him, and they were permitted to walk out of the room without cross-examination. So they could stand up and destroy his character, lying while they did so, and walk away without being cross-examined. Now, see, the precedent in that case means that if the government begins to come after people, like they have to rewrite the whole legal system. If they begin to prosecute people under the names of Agents Bill, they can't, the citizens' defense of this was the truth, this horrible thing was happening, which might make some points with the jury, cannot be brought out. They'll claim national security. So they will allow government witnesses to come in and testify for the prosecution, but they will not allow them to be cross-examined to pull out the whole truth to defend the individual. This is what we're getting into with the new law.
Legal libel, legal slander?
Legal libel, legal slander, legal biased information, and depriving the citizen, the defendant, of the right to defend himself, to get the full information out. It's a new law. It's a new era we're getting into. It's 180 degrees new from what this country is all about. And again, I repeat the irony that the beauty of it from the CIA's point of view is that the great mass of the American people, including the press and the movers of the society, are oblivious of what's happening.
John, we wanted to thank you for coming on our show to revealing to our audience here exactly what's at stake in this name of agents bill. And we also want to tell you that next week we have some more revelations, some startling revelations about recent CIA activity with Louis Wolff of the Covert Action Information Bulletin, who will be back, and John Stockwell will again comment on some of Louis's revelations. We'll have some more updated stories about the CIA. So the CIA watch continues on Alternative Views.
And now for some...
John, there has been over the last few years also a small handful of journalists who have been sort of CIA watchdogs, most prominent of which has been Louis Wolff. We have an interview with him. Maybe you can, to introduce this interview, tell us a little bit about Louis Wolff and his journalistic publications. Who is Louis and what has he been doing over the years, and why is the government so outraged by him?
Well, his background is it's thoroughly legitimate, standard, if you will, journalism. He was assigned for a couple of years in Manchester, writing for a couple of prominent news organizations.
Manchester, England?
Yes, Manchester, England. And eventually made his way through London back to the United States, where he gravitated to scrutiny of the CIA and the intelligence community, watching the revelations of the Church Committee, information that he had come across in his research, some of which he had published as part of news stories previously, other parts of which he was not permitted to publish by the nature of the press establishment. And so he put together with Bill Schaap and Ellen Ray the Covert Action Information Bulletin, whose function was to focus on the intelligence organizations of the United States and discuss and expose in a perfectly legitimate way the covert action activities of the CIA principally, as well as the other intelligence organizations. I believe they formed that in about 1976 and have been in Washington since, publishing stories of true stories. Their quality, their standards of journalism are exceedingly high. That bulletin is distributed in the State Department, and it's sold out the first morning that it's put on the stands in the State Department newsstands. They also publish in that bulletin the names of CIA agents and where they are now, as they're assigned and reassigned about the world. I believe that in very recent months they have ceased the policy of publishing names because the controversy is so hot, and they would just as soon... And also, it's never been their intention to break the law. They've made that clear from the outset. Bill Schaap is the brother. He is a highly competent attorney and is the brother of a top sportscaster in New York City. He is a very articulate man himself and has testified to the Senate many times against the names of Agents Bill, for example, and defending what he and Lou Wolff are doing. And after his testimony, many times senators have come up and shaken his hand and said, I disagree with you, but you certainly make your case for the legitimacy of what you're doing very well.
Let's take a look at some of the things which Louis Wolff had to say, and we'll let you comment ever so often on this, okay?
What, in the years that you've been publishing it, do you think are some of your most significant revelations? Are there some stories that even shocked you?
Well, I think one of the big stories that we were able to document in some detail was the whole scope of CIA activities, similar to what the CIA did in Chile, and which was documented by the Senate Select Committee, was the whole covert action program in Jamaica in between 1976 and 1980, and we did a great deal of research into that, and we discovered in many ways a very similar program, almost a classic model that was followed along the lines of what they did in Chile, including three major categories: military, paramilitary activity, the use of propaganda in the media, and the third one, which was economic warfare, using the multilateral organizations, the International Monetary Fund and others, to withhold loans which had been promised to the Jamaican government. This is one example.
What are a couple more of the details of that? You mentioned those first two examples of actual paramilitary activity the CIA was involved in Jamaica.
There was a fire, for example, that took place in Jamaica of an old people's home. I think 150 old and infirmed women, many of them blind, were living in this home. And as it turned out, the place burned down in the space of about 8 minutes, 7 or 8 minutes. It was discovered that the phone wires had been cut and that the exits had all been blocked. Even those who could see their way out could not get out. That the means by which the fire was set was the use of a petroleum jelly, which was unavailable in Jamaica. This was one indication, among others, that there was outside help. Why would the CIA, you might ask, why would the CIA want to murder 150 old women? It was because it was an effort, part of a very large-scale effort to discredit the government in Jamaica, which was at the time headed by Michael Manley, the Prime Minister. There were images produced of Michael Manley in the media, in the Daily Gleaner, which was the newspaper which the United States, through the CIA, helped to support. And there is a good deal of evidence of that. There were images of Michael Manley showing a death mask. I mean, it was his face which had been somehow made to look like a death mask, although it was pretending to be a photograph of him. And there were many ways to try and discredit him. This is very, very similar, in fact, to what the CIA did to try and discredit Salvador Allende in Chile. If you remember, Richard Nixon instructed the CIA in a meeting which was in 1970 in the White House, and there was a document in the Senate report which is reprinted, and he said, "Make the economy scream." Those were his words. And that's, of course, what the CIA proceeded to do in Chile, and that's what they also did in Jamaica.
They also furnished a lot of munitions and assistance to the terrorist squads that were going around killing people in the cities and also in the countryside in Jamaica as well.
That's correct.
Well, John, you had a trip down to Jamaica, and you saw a lot of these things about Jamaica with your own eyes, right?
Yes, indeed. A very moving, a very interesting trip to me to see a target country at a time in the height of a CIA operation when I was completely outside. So there's no way that I could see the problem that journalists have always had when the U.S. government was targeting on a country in a situation, trying to destabilize it, overthrow, or manipulate the elections or whatever, of trying to figure out what's going on when you don't have access to all of the flow of cables and the discussions in National Security Council meetings and whatnot for the planning. I observed that from published information, the CIA station there was quite large for that size of a country. It was huge, in fact. It was bigger than any station I knew of in Africa, although Jamaica was a fairly small island with 2 million people. That's typical of when the CIA has got a big operation going in a place. They beef up the station and beef up the offices back stateside. The tone and flow of articles in the Gleaner was, of course, as Lou says, definitely a chapter out of Chile or a chapter out of the Angolan operation. Every indication of a massive CIA operation going to destabilize the government, to make the economy scream, and in that case, I would say that probably someone got promoted for that one, probably several people.
Because Manley was run out of office.
Because it worked.
By a legitimate
without without a scandal, without an assassination, without the things that have caused the CIA so much grief, Manley, a champion of social democracy, of giving the people a piece of the pie, was thrown out of office, and an arch-capitalist was put in office. And again, there was minimal adverse publicity. Lew Wolf and the others were studying the situation and did publish about what was going on, but it was not published in the New York Times and the Washington Post, and the big television networks didn't do studies on it, primarily because even if the journalists of the big organs knew what was happening and might have wanted to, they really, just because of the secrecy, couldn't get the truth about what the United States was doing. One interesting thing was that the effectiveness of the liars in our government, you know, the duplicity. When we formed the CIA, we committed our leaders to having two policies, as Lew says: the rhetoric, the public statements, and the truth about what United States policy is. So an interesting measure of presidents is how effectively they lie. Interesting discussions that occur inside the CIA is about lying. Would you lie? You know, you're the DDO and you're going to testify to the Senate, and it's serious discussions. Are you going to lie? Because if you do, it's perjury, and there's a chance you could go to jail, and yet, you know, the organization expects you to lie. President Carter was one of the most effective liars I have ever watched on television and through the media. As a poker player, man, I would never go up against that man. He could look at that camera and say things that obviously he knew were completely and totally false. And I would study his expression, and I could detect nothing except occasionally a little wisp of a smile that wasn't consistent with what he was saying, like he thought it was funny. But one of his more classic
tick, actually.
Yeah, well, the smile that I was referring to wasn't that. It was just a kind of like he was repressing a grin, like he thought it was funny. How he rationalized these things, I don't know. But one of his most conspicuous lies was when he sat down with Manley just a few weeks before the elections in Washington and told him face to face that the CIA, don't have the CIA doing anything to destabilize you or your government. We have no such program going, when obviously he did. And he pulled it off to the point where even Manley was troubled. Very effective liars.
Another major story that we uncovered was the whole range of CIA media operations throughout the world. We did an analysis of these operations and the use of money, very large-scale money. It's thought between 1/3 and 40% of the CIA's budget. And I should say that that budget figure is the biggest secret that there is in Washington today. At that time, it was estimated that the 1978 budget was in the range of $1.5 billion. A more recent estimate by a military journal, not a liberal journal by any means, estimated that the CIA's budget today is in the range of $10 billion. At any rate, this analysis that we made of the CIA's media operations disclosed, among other things, that they deliver through CIA couriers ready to print or ready to broadcast news, and I put that in inverted commas, which is used by the media. And this is created by the CIA.
How often does the CIA manipulate the media in this way, plant stories, get their views in the media? Is this fairly common as a modus operandi for the CIA?
It goes beyond your, in the course of the past 30 years, it goes beyond your wildest imagination, the extent to which the CIA has gone to manipulate public opinion. If you include the MH Chaos program, which was a $1 billion program of setting up proprietary companies, setting up student organizations so they could draw radical students in and do every kind of duplicitous manipulation of national student movements, press, propaganda, labor, extensive formation of labor unions, funding of major labor unions, with the objective essentially of manipulating the mind and attitudes of workers throughout the nation and the world. This was the essential tool that they used to destabilize Chile and overthrow Allende. Was, of course, making the economy scream, getting to the military officers, but it was essentially the truckers' union that finally brought the country down and justified, quote, justified Pinochet's takeover of power. 5,000 university professors they've co-opted. This is Church Committee revelations. I'm not making this up. It's in print. Church Committee's revelations. 5,000 university professors co-opted to help the CIA manipulate people's minds. 400 journalists in the U.S., including big-name journalists. Now, that's a big chunk of the prominent journalists co-opted to function routinely to help the CIA put out its stories and biases to the world.
There are a whole range of areas wherein the CIA provides briefings to selected journalists, and there are numerous cases where the CIA has, for example, published books, and several thousand books were published in English by the CIA, and this is documented in the Church Committee report. They set up 250 news services and wire services, some of which, not all, but some of which are still in the pocket of the CIA. And I think it's only fair to say that even some journalists who don't realize, there are some who are witting, but there are also some who do not realize that they're being targeted by the CIA when they come home from a trip overseas. They might talk to somebody and they don't realize, at least right away, who they're talking to, and then it turns out that they've been the source of information which was used by the CIA.
And then specific operations around the world from corner to corner to discredit this individual, create an impression about that situation, such as El Salvador, the famous white papers in the Angolan operation, which I note were, you know, back in the good old days, we did a better job. Our white papers in the Angolan operation were based on very specific photographs and hard information of Soviet ships putting into Porto Ambuim in Angola. The white paper that the CIA produced for Alexander Haig to justify the intervention in El Salvador was a piece of trash. It was discredited by the right and the left and the center. It didn't hold together.
I should point, for example, to the stories that came out during the Angola operation, where it was discovered that the CIA was involved in a massive covert operation, which the Congress cut off when they learned about it. There were certainly a small handful, really a tiny handful, you could count them on the fingers of one hand, of the members of Congress who knew about that operation and the scale of it beforehand, and then they cut it off. Well, one of the revelations at the time that came out was that the CIA had created a story that was planted in the media that the Cubans who were in Angola at the time were raping Angolan women, and that they were really doing very, very gross things to these women and killing them. Well, it was disclosed, in fact, by John Stockwell, among other people, who was the former CIA station chief, or in charge of the CIA's task force in Angola, that whole story was created by the CIA station in Zambia and in Zaire, where they sat around a table and wrote this story, and then it was fed to a stringer, who then fed it to a news service, who then got it to the AP, Associated Press, who then picked it up and was sent around the world, and it was printed in hundreds of newspapers as fact.
But you can rest assured that it is at least very difficult for the American people, including us, to know what is true about the Sandinista government in Nicaragua, for example, or about El Salvador, or about Argentina and the Falklands right now. Our former ally of a month ago is now our enemy in this confrontation. In Jamaica, for example, and then this very specific, the Libyan hit squad, the mythical Libyan hit squad. We had a situation where President Reagan and President Gaddafi were confronting each other internationally. Reagan ordered our ship into what Libya claims is its waters with the specific intention of either standing Gaddafi down or provoking an incident. And it worked. He shot down 2 Libyan jet fighter planes. And then Gaddafi was incensed, and there was a credibility problem. There was the president of the giant United States confronting this relatively small Arab country.
I guess this leads us to your Covert Action Information Bulletin, because there's a story in here about the hit squads, and it actually originated apparently with the Israeli secret police, the Mossad.
It's a very interesting case study of how these propaganda operations can come about. Apparently, since the Israelis, working as they have for many years very closely, the Israeli Secret Intelligence Service, or Mossad, has worked very, very closely with the CIA, and in fact the CIA helped to set it up back in the mid-50s. Originally, part of the story came from Mossad, that there were 2 people who apparently were either employed or were agents, contract agents for Mossad, who fed some of this information to the U.S. government.
I see.
And the U.S. government was fully prepared to believe it. They said that one of their witnesses, or one of their sources, had been polygraphed and had checked out, his information had checked out. There was a story suggesting that it was reported by one of the networks that somebody had been offered $250,000 for his information, to the effect that there were hit squads. And some of it originated, as I said, from Mossad, and some of it originated from CIA fabrications. Jack Anderson, for example, reported that some of the information that he had been given and reported in his column had turned out to have been CIA fabrications. It's important to remember that the Israelis, as much, I guess, as the U.S., considers it a priority to discredit and to possibly destabilize or overthrow the Libyan government. And one method that they thought of, I guess, was to create a story that said that Libya had sent death squads to assassinate President Reagan and other high officials.
Go ahead.
Well, only recently, some of the same high officials who before were saying that that they had evidence that some of these hit squads had entered the country through Canada, are now on record and quoted in Newsweek and in other media saying that they never located a single person and a single evidence that there was a hit squad, and yet they say there is still a threat. Well, I think it's fair to assume, though there is not enough information yet to say, but it's fair to assume that the CIA was hoping through this to create a justification for further intervention in Libya, possible military activity or economic boycott or blockade, as they've now proposed, as has been proposed by the White House.
Well, let's take a look at some of the articles in the latest issue of the Covert Action Information Bulletin. Not only will it give you an idea of what the magazine is about, it's, oh my goodness, over 50 pages, but also it gives, just this one issue, gives a good example of the widespread operations not only of the CIA, it's not just restricted to the CIA, but mercenary activities around the world as well. We have been following the Seychelles Island attempted coup ever since it started, and we did a program with John Stockwell just recently where we mentioned that. I noticed on page 4 you have an article that says Seychelles beat back the mercenaries. This is quite a complex operation which involves South Africa and mercenaries and the French. Was the CIA involved in that?
There's still a lot of information that will come out, but it is known that some of the activity, I should say primarily the main source of the coup or attempted coup was South Africa. That South African intelligence, including one admitted so-called former member of the South African Intelligence Corps, who says that he, quote unquote, retired in order to go for a visit to the Seychelles for his vacation. And largely the program was initiated by the South Africans. It does appear, however, that the United States, which has had an ongoing interest in creating a base of operations in the Indian Ocean, and the Seychelles is a very strategic area, not just because of its it has no large natural resources as such, but that it is of critical importance to the U.S. as a jumping point in the Indian Ocean.
It looks like there are other aspects too, that they're also trying to keep the government of Mauritius from becoming a more progressive government. There were some significant elections coming up. Plus, there was something I didn't know at all, and that was the fact that there is an island chain, Comoros, which actually were taken over in a coup, which was carried out by mercenaries.
Yes, in that case, it was largely French intelligence which was the source of that one. There is some indication that the CIA was involved, though somewhat peripherally, in that one.
So I can see where that could stimulate people like in the group down in New Orleans of missionaries. Boy, they are, in a way, aren't they? of mercenaries that were going to take over Dominica.
Yes.
Since apparently the plot fell through for Grenada. And they've seen that it can happen in Comoros, that they actually can take over an island government and run it.
The case of the attempted coup in Dominica is a very interesting one, and here the U.S. Involvement is rather strong. There was an attempt to build a force mainly made up of members of the Ku Klux Klan, together with some other former and active mercenaries who had long involvement in U.S. Special Forces and Army background. And their first idea was to invade Grenada, but then they realized that the Grenadian government probably would be able to offset their activities and probably defeat them, and since their security forces are quite well organized there. And so they changed their plan and decided to go into Dominica. The former Prime Minister, Patrick John, who was very, very closely identified with South Africa, in fact, he had helped to set up a monitoring station and also a base for the manufacture of long-range torpedoes, which could be built with the help of South Africa, which he helped to set up. And basically, he had hoped that if the coup succeeded, and he agreed with the Klan people, that if it succeeded, that he would give them rights to casinos, to gambling operations, he would even give them several posts in his cabinet if he came back to power. Well, of course, needless to say, it failed. But
see, was there some dopes,
yes,
some narcotics business involved
exactly,
there too, wasn't
also.
There?
As there often is in these things.
This is on page 44, by the way. We're getting a little bit ahead of it.
Yeah,
this is also covered in the same.
Yes.
This highlights a point, though, that we've made several times on this show, how the CIA will use anyone to carry through their objectives. The Ku Klux Klan, mercenaries, the mafia, drug operations. It's reasons like this that John Stockwell thinks that the CIA is completely corrupt and immoral operation.
Not to mention the 800,000 people that have been killed through CIA operations.
I think 800,000 is a very, very conservative figure, but yes, that's correct. There is clearly a trend today in the CIA to move more in the direction of contracting out some of the operations that it does not really want to get itself, not that it doesn't want to get involved, but doesn't want to get caught with its pants down doing it. And so some of the more sensitive activities they're branching out and letting either other intelligence services or other quote-unquote private freelance types.
It looks like that they are developing a very significant alliance with the South Africans and the Argentinians. Once again, these are both covered in this edition of the Covert Action Information Bulletin. Angola, the Pretoria's continuing war, talks about the South African involvement there. Mozambique rebels exposed. Once again, we find South Africa involved in that.
And the CIA in that case.
Yeah, and the CIA. And then we get to an article here about Argentina activates international death squads. And this article shows that these, wretched, horrible people involved in tremendous amount of torture and maiming and killing of people in Argentina are now, like I say, they're subcontractees. And not only that, but the U.S. is trying to make a regional type of kind of a NATO. It's called SATO, which is a good SATO for SATO. But anyway, with South Africa taking care of the area in the Indian Ocean and Africa, and Argentina taking care of Central America and South America. In fact, Argentina said they would be glad to come up and help with the El Salvadorian folks, right?
That's correct. Argentina, if there's a country in the world that has perfected the art of torture and the art of making people disappear, it is Argentina. And thousands upon thousands of Argentinians have disappeared. And I think that this article demonstrates, and this was an article which we did a lot of research on, and which was the result of a lot of press reports which came out, in some of them in South Africa itself, of the fact that the Argentinians had sent some of their more renowned and best known torturers to South Africa because they could no longer be active in Argentina. They were so well known. So they sent them to South Africa as part of the diplomatic corps in the Argentine embassy.
And they were specialists in torture.
Yes, go ahead.
It is unclear at this point whether they were advising the South Africans, who also know a good deal about how to torture people and how to make people die in prison, as they have the highest rate of death of people in their prisons. Whether in fact they're training each other is unclear, but certainly they have a good deal of sharing and common interests involved.
We showed the movie on company business, or sections of the movie on company business, which you might remember. This movie showed the complicity of the CIA with torture all around the world. As a matter of fact, there are CIA torture schools in the United States. They bring people over here from various countries abroad, police, military, teach them the very sophisticated ways of torture, then they go back and operate on their own folks back home. And just to make sure that everything goes right, the CIA then has their agents which go down and supervise. They hold clinics, they bring people off the streets and torture them. I mean, it sounds like something which you couldn't even think up out of a sick imagination, but this is what goes on. And the next article in your bulletin for March talks about the Salvadorian deserter who disclosed the Green Beret torture roll. This was in the news just recently, and it has actually the transcript and a considerable summary of what actually went on. And it showed the Americans supervising and helping out, and they tortured the first person to show that how it's to be done. This was a 14-year-old boy. And the next person brought in was a 13-year-old girl. And of course, after raping her, then they let the El Salvadorians try it and make sure they did it right.
It's a gruesome story, and I think this is an example of something that the American people are being asked to overlook or to turn a blind eye to. That is the brutality of the Salvadoran government. It is not a case of President Duarte as quote-unquote a moderate person who's trying to stand up to the forces both from left and right.
Which the New York Times always says.
Exactly. It was, in fact, the New York Times in a story in January who disclosed the first part of the story, which was that the Green Berets, 8 of them, were present during a torture session. And it was a major story. Strangely, it was such a major story, but it was on page 2 of the New York Times rather than on page 1. But it was a very big and important story. I would say, however, that one of the reasons, I guess, was that the member of the Salvadoran army who talked about this, who is now deserted and who is living in Mexico, he was somewhat intimidated, I guess, by talking to the New York Times, and he's later revealed to Mexican media, and that's the transcript in this article, that the Special Forces, and I should say the U.S. Special Forces, was created originally by the CIA. The Special Forces were actually involved in the torture as opposed to standing by observing it.
You said they didn't rape the little girl, though. I mean, there is some morality left,
yes.
Right?
Louis, how does this torture and all of these CIA covert operations fit into American foreign policy? as a whole. You have a couple articles in your current journal about the role of the CIA in these sorts of operations we're talking about within American foreign policy. Could you focus on that for a minute?
Well, I guess it comes down to the whole doctrine that the United States feels it has to keep its role and its sphere of influence, or its spheres of influence, and part of this is putting governments in power, and part of it is keeping them in power. Now, there are many governments with whom the United States has been closely identified around the country who cannot stay in power without massive repression. Of course, El Salvador is one. There are many others around the world in all the 3 continents.
Argentina and South Africa for 2.
Absolutely.
Obvious examples.
South Korea is another example, and the Philippines. I think we have to understand, though, that why would the United States do this? Is it simply to keep somebody who is a friend of the United States in power? Successive presidents, and it's not just Reagan, and it's not Carter before him, it's successive presidents basically since the 50s, since Eisenhower, have been working hand in glove, and even have been on camera embracing successive dictators with whom we've been identified. The most recent example, if you remember, was the case of Jimmy Carter embracing the Shah of Iran a few months before he was overthrown on the steps of the White House. I think it's because of the CIA's involvement and, in fact, direction of much of these activities. It's not that the CIA is working on its own, as some people suggest, as a rogue elephant. The CIA works directly under the guidance and direction of the Chief of State, of the President. And of course this President not only doesn't know, but doesn't want to know every day what the CIA is doing. But the fact of the matter is that they're doing what the President asked them to do. And the other thing I should just mention quickly is that the CIA carries out these activities to keep the interests of the corporations, U.S. corporations, who have great interests at stake, for example, in South Africa and in all the other countries we've mentioned.
That's right. The multinationals value stability above everything else, plus the ability to operate there, keep the economy low as far as wages, and be able to take the riches out of the country. And these right-wing dictatorships let them do that. Of course, there's a point which is reached, like in El Salvador, once it gets too far and the people really start a revolution, then the multinationals suffer there.
And there's a certain level beyond which the U.S., when it becomes publicly known, as opposed to known in the country itself, publicly known in the United States, that the U.S. is so closely identified with such a repressive regime as today in El Salvador, that it finally realizes it has to fish or cut bait. It has to decide whether we continue to support this openly, or whether we have to find other ways to support, as for example, Argentina has now offered, we understand, directly to the United States to be a surrogate for the U.S. in El Salvador. Also Honduras is playing that role.
This is what's so chilling about this Agents, Identities, Information Act, that it will cover over the possibility of the media exposing the worst abuses of the CIA, which will mean the American people won't know what it's doing. We'll have a secret government, and we will therefore increase the power and the scope of operations of the CIA. Whereas in the past, when there has been media and public focus on CIA operations and excesses, there has been pressure to cut back on the CIA.
I think, however, the most threatening part of this is the whole move towards greater and greater secrecy, and so that the media will not even have the opportunity to report on this whole area. It will be illegal almost for a journalist for one of the major media to write or to report about intelligence. In many ways, that will just be beyond the pale now.
This also ties in with the progress of Senate Bill 1 in the Senate, or the great-grandson of Senate Bill 1, which is designed to take away a lot of our civil liberties. We're gradually becoming a police state, really, it looks like, doesn't it?
Well,
What can be done about it?
Well, I don't feel it's fair to be rhetorical about this. I agree that there is a move towards greater and greater secrecy and greater or less and less accountability of the government to the people. And there are, of course, a lot of people who are opposed to this, including quite a few members of Congress. For example, 29 members of Congress signed a resolution challenging the right of the president to intervene in El Salvador. Under the War Powers Act, he has no right to do this, and they're challenging his right. And that's 29 members out of hundreds, but it is a significant, I think, indication that there is, even in the halls of Congress, opposition to his policies.
As well as in the country at large. I mean, the overwhelming majority are against Reagan's policy in El Salvador.
And I think the recent polls have shown that the foreign policy in general is not entirely accepted, or there is great doubt and great wonderment as to whether there's any continuity, whether the policy is thought out, whether it's based on realities or only the very anti-communist rhetoric of this administration. There are also quite a few people high in the administration who have intelligence backgrounds, and this is another indication that the intelligence is on the rise in this administration.
This is the final question, and to conclude, what can the American people do against these worst excesses of the CIA, and indeed against the threats to all of our civil liberties involved in some of these bills that are being passed that will unleash the CIA?
I think the biggest thing is that people can educate themselves as to what is going on, to read their press, and to demand to know what is going on from the media, to try and exercise their rights, that is to let their member of Congress know that they don't accept whatever the policy may be, even to demonstrate publicly if they're opposed to these activities. I think most of all is to keep themselves informed and to speak out against it.
Well, thank you very much. Let's focus on one of the current and most spectacular revelations that the CIA has made in recent years, and that is their expose of Nicaragua that was just yesterday, the day before we're taping this, where a Department of Defense personnel and a CIA director, Bobby Inman, yes, I think it was, claimed to have photographs that showed that Nicaragua was greatly increasing their military forces, that it was on the same model as Cuba's, that this was all being funded by the Soviet Union, that Nicaragua was systematically carrying out genocidal operations against Indian tribes living in Nicaragua. They had pictures of villages that had been destroyed. What would your attitude towards this be?
I think the first time that I can remember since the Bay of Pigs that a single, there may have been one other case, but it's almost the only case since then that the CIA or U.S. intelligence has disclosed satellite data from which they say this came. Now, satellite data by its very nature, and depending on how far they enlarge it, can be made to prove anything. These pictures, I'm not saying, I do not know, I have not seen the pictures, but we are asked to believe that these pictures were taken within the last several months in Nicaragua or over Nicaragua by U.S. satellites. We are further asked to believe that the activity which is portrayed in these pictures is taking place as of now. Recently, Secretary Haig said, and he held it up as the smoking gun in a press conference, that his information was that the Nicaraguan government was engaged in massive repression against the Mosquito Indians.
Right, that was the big point they made again yesterday with these pictures of burned out villages.
Well, one of those, the picture to which Secretary Haig referred to in his press conference 10 days ago was a picture which was published in Le Figaro magazine in Paris. And it later turned out that that picture had been published with a caption saying that this was the present Nicaraguan government showing them burning houses and burning people alive, I believe. It turned out that that picture, and Le Figaro has admitted it since then, was a picture that was taken during the Somoza rule, and that those pictures were 4 or 5 years old. And of course, Mr. Haig has had to, or General Haig has had to pull back on that one, but they are now still saying that there's massive repression against the Mosquito Indians. I would simply point out that it's a dichotomy and a contradiction for this government to give a great deal of attention to the human rights of mosquitoes if in fact these abuses are taking place when in fact Native Americans are not accorded the same attention by our government.
Nor are the El Salvadorian people who are systematically being killed by these death squads that are...
And the Guatemalan Indians are being almost annihilated. It's almost a genocidal campaign by the Guatemalan government against the Indians in Guatemala. I do hope that some of this... well, first of all, there is a lot of evidence coming out that the part of the campaign by the CIA against Nicaragua is through paramilitary units and squads of former Somocista soldiers who are being trained in Honduras. And their campaign is against these Mosquito Indians, and hundreds of mosquitoes have been killed by those squads in cross-border raids. One of the reasons why that the Nicaraguan government has been forced, I believe, by these campaigns to move a lot of these people away from the areas where they're in danger is because of those activities, not because of a policy of the Nicaraguan government. It's as a result
What
of
would their reason
the
be to have genocide against these tribes, the current government in Nicaragua? The State Department hasn't given any hypotheses about why they would be engaging in this.
I can't see any motive for it.
Yeah, it seems strange.
Well, they pretend and would have us believe that the Nicaraguan government is a totalitarian, one-party, top-down dictatorial rule, and that they have no wish to integrate the Mosquito Indians into their society, and that furthermore they have us believe that the Mosquitoes want to secede or want to have an independent country or state, or at least an area which they can call a separate country. I don't think there's any evidence to show that that's what the Mosquito Indians wish.
John, since the time we did that interview with Louis Wolff, there's been quite a few revelations about CIA covert operations in Nicaragua. Can you comment on those? I think there were some stories in these times about some of the things that the CIA was up to there.
I can comment in a speculative way, since I don't, I'm analyzing the news now based on my past experience, of course. But let's see, what's the inflation rate since 1975 to 1982?
In America?
Yeah. What would that amount to, 5 years?
It's been about 10% a year.
Almost.
Even more.
The point is that the CIA's budget, it's been announced that the CIA, the President signed an order on the 1st of December ordering the CIA into full paramilitary covert action against Nicaragua from Honduras, organizing mercenaries to destabilize the countryside, to counter the Cuban aggression in that country, is what they announced was the justification. And the budget they were given was $19 million. I compare that with the $14 million that I was given in 1975
in Angola
for the Angolan operation. The parallels are quite striking. There were parallels with the Angolan operation in the Bay of Pigs, for example, and other covert actions. But then Guatemala was different, and Iran was different. So each situation is different. But here we have it's so close. They're working from Honduras. We were working from Zaire and Kinshasa. They're working with ex-Somocistas. We were working with the Portuguese exiles, the Portuguese who had fled, for example, creating an army out of these people. Also, they have, quote, mercenaries, but actually soldiers, who were sent from Argentina, for example, and Venezuela and Chile and Colombia, to join this force. We had people coming from various places, from France, for example, and of course the South African force. They're functioning I could map out the office for you, the program, the international program. Some things that I would observe if you've read my book is that such an operation is global. The commander would not be sitting in Honduras running the thing. The commander of the Nicaraguan task force will be in Washington. He will be sending agents all around the world coordinating different aspects of this thing. They'll be sending cables to every station in the world advising the chief of station what his activities should be vis-a-vis the local police and the local president and the local press to create an atmosphere supporting to the greatest extent possible what they're doing, seeking arms that aren't attributable, seeking sources of news comments and releases that can be put together in white papers to persuade. And then the bottom line, that the justification Reagan has given and the CIA have given for doing this intervention is to counter the Cuban activities in Nicaragua. But see, the point is that there are not going to be any Cubans die in this thing. I believe it's said that there are 2,000 Cubans in Nicaragua now. They're functioning to help build an airport and no doubt military advising, although I've not seen that confirmed anywhere.
A lot of doctors, medical personnel.
Doctors and medical personnel and teachers and whatnot.
And from Italy and several other countries as well. It's not just Cubans that have gone to Nicaragua, but a variety of countries.
The Nicaraguan arms, it's been shown, are not coming from the Soviet Union. They're buying them from France and Italy and all kinds of other places. Or are they coming from Cuba? This has been proven by it. But the point is that this program of the CIA is not going to be killing Cubans. It's going to be killing Nicaraguans. It's not going to be killing Nicaraguan officials, not that many Nicaraguan soldiers. It's going to be destabilizing the countryside, blowing up bridges, ambushing buses. If they follow the pattern that they have in other places, there'll be some schools bombed and marketplaces bombed to destabilize the economy so it can't function, so the network and fabric of society will break down.
They kill village leaders. I've read articles about that.
The Phoenix program being duplicated, killing village leaders, hauling people out and executing them to terrorize them from cooperating with the government.
And their families.
And their families.
In fact, the last 3 weeks in these times has had some very good articles on Nicaragua that indicates that from Honduras, some hit squads were sent into Nicaragua that have killed at least 30 leaders and just innocent people in that region and have terrorized peasants and people living in Nicaragua near the Honduras border because of these hit raids. Although on the other hand, they've led these people to organize and become even more firm and resolute in their will to protect their country. So sometimes these destabilization programs backfire and end up stabilizing the country and unifying
it certainly did in the Bay of Pigs. The CIA invasion there unified Cuba under Fidel Castro. He came out of that thing 10 times, 100 times stronger than he was going into it. And that probably will be in effect in Nicaragua. These Nicaraguans dying will be added to the 800,000 I mentioned earlier, the victims, people who die as direct victims of CIA covert actions in the last 30 years. The minimum figure given by all responsible parties and press and government studies and whatnot is 800,000. The figures range from 800,000 to a couple of million victims of CIA operations.
Right. Indirect type of...
Indirect. Now, that does not include, for example, the people who died in the Vietnam War, which was a direct result of a CIA covert action.
Or the, what, 1.5 million in Indonesia.
The 1.5 million in Indonesia. Now, that's a lot of dead people. Now, the circumstances of this killing are pure terrorism. Recruiting terrorists to go across the border and blow up and assassinate and kill. We have to remember that. The next time President Reagan or Alexander the Hague are making their pious statements about the threat of international terrorism and the horrors of international terrorism, the United States is, without any serious competition, leading the world in international terrorism today and for the past 30 years.
John, isn't there something unique about this Nicaraguan situation is that the administration is openly admitting that they are carrying it on?
That's truly a difference, and this gets back to the rogue elephant. Is the CIA a rogue elephant, or has it all these years been doing what the president wants? And of course the truth is both. In some cases it's done what it wanted, contrary to presidential orders. In other cases it's done what the president probably wanted but didn't say. In this case, because of the nature of the Secretary of State and the President, the CIA is clearly doing exactly what the President wanted. Now, the President didn't hold a press conference to say, I'm sending in the CIA to kill people in Nicaragua, but it has been admitted by the White House that they did. It's been leaked, and the President smiled at the leaks, that he did order the CIA into this action. So he's clearly, he sees himself as, Marshal Reagan, sort of, showing off how he can shoot. Let those people know he's got something he can do.
Louis, while we're on Central America, we might also note that your group has published a book called White Paper, Whitewash, in which you analyze the infamous white paper that was published by the American government to justify American intervention in El Salvador. Can you just briefly indicate some of the obvious whitewash in the white paper and some of the things published in your book, and then maybe we can tell our audience where they can get this?
The white paper was published in 1979 well, I should say, I'm sorry, there were prior indications of propaganda about U.S. intervention in El Salvador, but the original white paper that we're talking about here came out in 1981, February 1981, and it was said to have been captured. There are a series of documents that were captured by the Salvadoran armed forces. Now, we should remember, first of all, that there were three accounts offered as to how the information was captured. One said it was found by a State Department intelligence man who went to El Salvador and saw it on a table in the headquarters of the Salvadoran Armed Forces. A second account said that it was found in what was called a safe house of the guerrillas in San Salvador. And the third and most unlikely account was that it was captured from a guerrilla who was found walking through the streets of El Salvador with a whole packet of documents under his arm. Each of those accounts were offered as the source of these documents. We have analyzed the documents. It's in this book, co-edited by Warner Polchow, or edited by Warner Polchow, with interviews with Philip Agee. And it's very interesting to analyze, as has been done in the book, line by line, word by word, the so-called white paper. There are parts of the paper, for example, that refer to, in English, sections of the so-called original Spanish language documents that don't exist. There are
creative translation.
Exactly. There's one document, for example, that's partly in Spanish, in handwritten Spanish, and then on the same document it's typewritten in English. So we're asked to believe that whomever was sitting down at the table writing these shopping lists for arms from Cuba, from Vietnam, from Ethiopia, and Libya, was going to move from a pen in Spanish to a typewriter and type in English, and I might say, very literary English. There are a lot of contradictions in the white paper. Basically, we should understand this because it was and is the first and the most important justification that has been used by the government for its intervention in El Salvador. Of course, now they pretend that because the white paper was so widely discredited, even by one of its authors who gave an interview to the Wall Street Journal and disclosed that he even had a lot of questions about it. So I think there's a lot of reason that this document, or this exercise in propaganda, is a classic in CIA propaganda.
Louis, if the audience wants to order this book, how can they get it?
Well, they can write to the publisher, which is Deep Cover Publications. Should I give the address? In Post Office Box 677, New York, 10013, and it's well, $
6.50 plus $1.50 handling.
Yeah.
And can people also get the mailing list for your other publications. You've published a book called Dirty Work, the CIA in Western Europe, and another one called Dirty Work, the CIA in Africa, as well as putting out this Covert Action Information Bulletin. Will you give information on how they can order those other publications?
They can write to us, to Covert Action Information Bulletin in Washington. I'll give the address,
okay.
Post Office Box 50272, 50272, Washington, D.C. 20004, and we'll be happy to send you the information.
I find this very sad, by the way. It troubles me, not obviously because I was once part of all this, but also just as an American citizen, to realize that this country is indulging in activities that are just as cruel and just as depraved in some cases, and almost as extensive as what, for example, the Gestapo indulged in Germany. We haven't liquidated 5 million Jews, but 800,000 minimum figure people killed in terrorist circumstances in the Third World is a lot of people dead. And the responsibility, ultimately, yes, it's done by the CIA and it's a secret organization, and therefore we have plausible denial to our own consciences because there's nothing we can do about it, we don't know about it, and they didn't consult us. But the other side of that coin is that the CIA is the United States police organ, and what it does, we, the American people, are responsible for. So that in addition to the personal losses of freedom of speech and freedom of the press, we are responsible for the genocide of terrorism that's taking place against the world today in our name and with our tax dollars.
And with the changes of the laws and executive orders, the whole apparatus of the intelligence services, including the FBI and their right-wing hit squad buddies like the Nazis and the Klan, are now being able to be turned on the American people.
Turned on the American
with
people.
impunity.
Remember that, Lou Wolf mentioning the executive order, which we've all followed with great interest. That, too, is President Reagan going public, bragging about what he's doing with the CIA. But don't forget that the CIA has always functioned extensively inside the United States. The MHKS, a $1 billion program, was all domestic. And MK Ultra experimentation on American citizens with drugs and LSD and whatnot, that went on for 20 years, and that was inside the United States on American guinea pigs. The opening of mail for 20 years was American citizens' mail. They've always done this thing. The Operation Mongoose war against Cuba was run from Florida, and they had over 1,000 safe houses and boat docks and whatnot that they were operating from the United States. The training facilities for torture, for interrogation techniques, were in San Antonio, Texas at one time, a few years back. And, that's something that's easy to move somewhere else. I don't know where it is today.
John, recently one of the individuals in the CIA that was in charge of these covert operations has recently resigned, and that is Admiral Bobby Inman, who was allegedly second in command at the CIA. It's been widely reported that Inman himself believed that William Casey, who is the director of the CIA, was overly fond of, quote, adventurous but ill-advised CIA operations abroad. And Senator Joseph Biden of Delaware has recently noted, without Inman, the intelligence agencies may be given license to try all kinds of questionable things here and abroad. In the light of what they've been doing, even under Inman already, what would be your comments on the Inman resignation in the future of the CIA?
Well, I would have to regret the fact that he left. Not that he was a paragon of liberal virtue, but he seemed to be, when compared with William Casey and some of the others, Jesse Helms over on the Senate side, Carlucci, his predecessor, he seemed to have some pretty strong instincts for protecting American institutions. He protested the Names of Agents bill at one time, or at least one version of it, as being unessential to American national security. And of course he got a lot of criticism for that. It would seem that he was, in effect, a moderating influence on some of the crueler instincts of men like Casey, who of course is a very inept and corrupt individual. The corruption being that he's maintained his own business portfolio. He's a millionaire. While he's CIA director, he's running the CIA, he's running his own businesses, and of course from the CIA he can have some influence on world economic matters. He has also been appearing at Republican fundraisers, and of course that's one of the biggest no-nos in the United States governmental system, to have the head of a police organization with the influence of the CIA to openly advocate one political party's position and help it raise money. In that kind of a corrupt, adventuresome atmosphere, one would have to regret Edmund's resignation. The whole milieu, the environment is favorable to Reagan and the CIA and what they want to accomplish, what they are accomplishing. If you go one step further and consider Reagan's policies his first year in office, he's muted this a little bit, faced with a clear indication by the American populace about war. He and Attila the Hague were speaking constantly about the viability of nuclear war. War was an effective tool. We shouldn't be afraid of war. Going to war in El Salvador, discussing sending troops into Nicaragua, talking frequently about going to the source, quote, in Cuba, and talking about, demonstration wars or limited wars, nuclear wars in Europe and whatnot. These people gave every indication that they were looking for war. Now, they have toned this down a little bit in the last 2 months. First, you saw the turn, we all saw the turn, everybody who reads the newspapers, when the polls responded. 89% of the American people said they did not favor American military intervention in Nicaragua. And this was a pretty clear indication to the president that the American people were not going to support him. He would not be a successful president if he got us into a war. It would be something that he would have trouble selling, trouble maintaining. At the same time, there was a move in Congress that if the government of El Salvador didn't modify its human rights positions, they wouldn't get more money for aid. And then the second thing, of course, has been this massive groundswell reaction to his attitudes towards the bomb. And that's national, every corner of the nation, little bitty towns across the nation organizing effectively and having big demonstrations, as well as the big cities. The nation and the world so deeply concerned about the threat of nuclear war, and just absolutely horrified that you could possibly have a president in office whose mental capacities were so limited that he would actually talk publicly of demonstration atom bombs in Europe, popping off a bomb to show our will and resolve, limiting nuclear war to Europe, and the possibility of surviving nuclear war in the United States. This has horrified people to the point where he's got a big political problem on his hand from the famous Ground Zero and the freeze. And the result is that it's forcing a change in their stated policies and attitudes. They're toning down quite a bit from what they were saying a year ago at this time, for example, responding to the mood of the nation in some frustration, I think, clearly.
Well, thank you, John.
That's fine. We've exhausted you again, but we